But what about the final step of that sequence? The conquest of Canaan, the land that had been promised to Abraham and his descendants. Would the earlier pattern of evidence continue there as well?
The children of Israel leave Egypt. They travel to Mount Sinai, where they received God's law and made a covenant to be his people. Then after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Moses transferred his authority to Joshua and ascended the heights of Mount Nebo, and there he died. The Israelites had been waiting centuries for the promise to be fulfilled, and now it was Joshua who would lead them in their conquest of Canaan.
The land of Canaan was very different from Egypt. It was a land ruled by many independent city-states with names like Hatzor, Jericho, Hebron, and Arad. The history of these cities has been divided into two major time periods: the Middle Bronze Age, matching Egypt's Middle Kingdom, when they were thriving and fortified by high walls. Then a sudden destruction and burning came upon the land, leaving those cities in ruins and bringing in a new period known as the Late Bronze Age, matching the time of Egypt's New Kingdom. Archaeologist Norma Franklin represents a large group of scholars that sees no evidence for a biblical conquest of the Promised Land.
As an archaeologist, I hate to disappoint people, but we have no evidence for a single mass migration of people from one country over a period of 40 years wandering and coming into another country. There is destruction. Amazing destructions. None of them actually fit one another. They all happened within 100 years, but not overnight. Not what you'd expect in, Joshua didn't live that long if he existed, okay.
First and foremost, many places which are mentioned in the Joshua, in the conquest story, specifically mentioned, as major places in Canaan, were excavated. And no evidence for a city in the Late Bronze Age has ever been found. And I'm speaking about major excavations. And we are speaking about many sites. It's systemic. It's not only a single site.
This is a serious problem for the conquest, if it really happened in the Late Bronze Age. But again, what if it happened in the earlier Middle Bronze Age? It seemed only logical to begin by looking at the key site of Jericho, the first city the Israelites are said to have destroyed. And we know exactly where that was.
Major archaeological excavations at Jericho began with a German team in the early 1900s led by Ernst Sellen. This was followed by a British team headed by John Garstang in the 1930s. At the time of their digs, both Sellen and Garstang believed they had uncovered a layer of destruction that matched the biblical story. However, things took a dramatic turn when Kathleen Kenyon dug at Jericho in the 1950s. She demonstrated that there was no evidence for a destruction of Jericho matching the biblical account because she dated the demise of the city much earlier. A wave of skepticism began to sweep across the field of archaeology. In an instant, Kenyon's discoveries at Jericho had undermined the entire Exodus story.
She was expecting that if there was any evidence there at all, it would be in what we call the Late Bronze Age. And it simply isn't there. If the Israelites had arrived in the 13th century, they'd have found almost nobody there, no walls to collapse. It just wouldn't have fitted the biblical narrative. So her excavations helped to compound this very negative view that was developing not just from Jericho, but from other sites as well.
Is there a time when Jericho was destroyed, where the walls fell down or it was burned?
I don't think so. I don't think that we have evidence, this kind of evidence in the case of Jericho. And I don't think that we can really look for this evidence. We are very much past this phase of archaeological research.
But David Rohl sees things differently.
If people are telling us that there was no Jericho at the time that Joshua conquered the Promised Land, and therefore Joshua is a piece of fiction, and therefore the conquest is a piece of fiction, and then probably Exodus is a piece of fiction as well, if that's the case, why don't we ask the simple question, well, when was Jericho around? When was Jericho destroyed? And start from that point of view.
The conquest began with the Israelites crossing the Jordan River. Joshua sent men to spy out the massively walled city of Jericho, and there they met a harlot named Rahab, who reported that all in the land had heard what God had done for the Israelites, and they were terrified. Rahab hid the spies and aided their escape to the mountains.
What evidence do you see matching the conquest of Jericho?
First of all, we're told that Jericho was fortified. When the archaeologists dug the city, particularly Kathleen Kenyon, when she did her work in the 50s, discovered that the tell that the city's built on was surrounded by a great earthen rampart.
Excavators found that Jericho was protected by a brilliant defensive system. At its base was a stone retaining wall more than 15 feet high, with a defensive extension wall of mud bricks rising higher still. Beyond this was the rampart, a steep slope covered with a slick surface of white plaster, where attackers would have been exposed to arrows and sling stones from above. At the top of this rampart was the main city wall, also made of mud brick, this one more than 25 feet high and 10 feet thick.
Imagine the dread and the desperate panic of the people of Jericho. Day after day for 6 days, the people of Israel are walking around their city with the Ark of the Covenant and the sounding of ram's horns. Then on the seventh day, they encircle the city 7 times, and the priests give a long blast on their horns. The people let loose with a mighty shout. The walls come tumbling down, allowing the Israelites to climb up into the city, taking it and commencing the conquering of the land of Israel.
Well, when the city met its end, these mud brick walls collapsed, and they actually fell down to the base of the stone retaining wall. Kenyon describes it very clearly and in detail in her excavation report. And then we're told they set the city on fire. And that's exactly what we find. Jericho was massively destroyed by fire. Kenyon said it was very clear that within the city, the walls of the buildings had fallen as well. And she says that the walls fell before the fire. And so we have the sequence that we read in the Bible. First, the fallen walls, and then the city being set on fire by the Israelites.
Excavations at the site uncovered clear evidence for a massive destruction by fire with a very thick burn layer of extremely high temperatures. This caused Kenyon to attribute the burning to an enemy attack and not fires that would result solely from an earthquake.
She claimed that the city was destroyed around 1550 BC by the Egyptians. Well, there's absolutely no evidence that the Egyptians were ever in the Jordan Valley at this time period.
So because Kenyon dated the destruction of Jericho 150 years before the Israelites were supposed to be there, she made no connection between the destruction and the biblical account. But once again, this date fits the earlier pattern I've been seeing.
Within the city, a very unique discovery was made. Both Garstang and Kenyon found in the houses that they excavated many jars full of grain that were stored there.
The store jars in the city were pretty full. That suggests the harvest had only recently been gathered in, and the details in the biblical account point to an event that happened sometime in the spring, And down there in the Jordan Valley, spring is when the harvest is gathered in, the grain harvest.
When the Israelites crossed the Jordan, the first thing they did was celebrate Passover. Well, when is Passover? Again, the spring of the year.
The full jars also indicate that if this was a siege, it was very short, unusual for a strong fortified city such as Jericho.
And that matches the biblical account because the siege was only 7 days. Otherwise, the people inside would have consumed a lot of that grain if it dragged out for months.
Was the grain found all over the city?
Yes. In every house that was excavated, they found jars of grain.
There's one other intriguing detail at Jericho that fits the Bible remarkably well. It had to do with a promise made to Rahab.
She actually lived in the city wall, and after hiding the spies, they promised her that she and her family would be protected when they attacked the city. And they kept their promise. She had marked her home with a scarlet cord, which she hung out the window.
But if her house was built into the city wall, how could it have survived?
I came across the actual archaeological report that the German excavator of Jericho, Ernst Sellen, had published in 1913. He was the first to conduct a major excavation of the site, and I could see that his work was impressive, but now seemed to have been forgotten. Here were detailed plans and photographs, including one part of the site, which echoed the Rahab story in an unexpected way.
The Germans found that in this one short stretch on the north side of the city, there were houses built on the rampart between the lower city wall and the upper city wall, and some of those houses were built right up against the lower city wall. They found that the city wall did not fall in this area. So that provides an explanation for how the spies could have saved Rahab and her family, because God brought the wall down everywhere else except where her house was, and we have archaeological evidence to back that up.
Well, what if people say, well, you're biased?
I think everybody in the field is biased, one way or another. I admit my bias. However, I cannot make up the evidence. I cannot plant it in the ground. I have analyzed it and compared it to the Bible, and I say, wow, it matches exactly. That's science. Look at your evidence and come to a conclusion based on the evidence.
Archaeologists have uncovered a city with high fortification walls that fell down, evidence that the city was intentionally burned after the collapse. Storage jars filled with charred grain, evidence of a short siege in springtime, and a section of houses within the wall, miraculously preserved, just as in the biblical account. According to the biblical account, Joshua spoke a curse against anyone who would rebuild the city of Jericho. And the archaeology shows that after the destruction, the city of Jericho was indeed abandoned for centuries. But of course, this all happens in the wrong time in the view of most scholars. Bryant Wood believes that Kenyon misdated the pottery at Jericho, resulting in a wrong destruction date. He, along with Charles Ayling, believe that the conquest occurred around 1400 BC using the conventional dates for Egypt and Canaan. However, David Roll and John Bimson have a different idea. They propose that Kenyon came to a wrong destruction date at Jericho because the dates assigned to the Middle Bronze Age are not correct, and these dates for history need a major adjustment. Regardless, all these scholars agree that Jericho was destroyed in a manner that matches the story of Joshua and the Israelites. But there's more to the conquest than just Jericho. Spies had reported that Canaan was a beautiful land, flowing with milk and honey. But it was also filled with great fortified cities that had walls reaching up to heaven. One by one, they would fall to Joshua.
Then Joshua turned north and headed for the city of Hazor. Jabin, king of Hazor, gathered all the kings of the region against Israel. Joshua captured Hazor and struck its king with the sword, and Joshua destroyed Hazor by fire.
Israeli archaeologists at Hazor found a massive burn layer from the same time as Jericho's destruction. They also found something else.
We found tablets in the Middle Bronze Age palace belonging to a king called Jabin, and that's the name of the king that Joshua actually stuck his sword into in the story.
This is the cuneiform tablet containing the name of Jabin, found in remains of the palace in ancient Hazor.
So you have a connection between the Bible story and these tablets.
We have a name that's identical. We have a tablet coming out of the ground with the name Jabin on it, and in the story of Joshua, Joshua killed King Jabin of Hazor.
Wow.